This is going to be a great year for fans of fantasy television. In the last days of August, we'll be getting the first episodes of the House of the Dragon prequel to Game of Thrones. And then in the first week of September, Amazon will counter with their Lord of the Rings prequel, The Rings of Power. Let's break it all down. In the red corner, the House of the Dragon. HBO first announced their slate of potential Game of Thrones spin-offs soon after the show came to an end. That ending was not so great, and many of the most ardent Game of Thrones fans felt they were done with the franchise at the time. If HBO had started a new Game of Thrones show that year, it would probably get killed in the ratings. But that was 3 years ago. Considering how much hype the House of the Dragon has gotten, it looks like people are ready to return to Westeros. It helps, of course, that the series is taking place 300 years before the Game of Thrones, and it focuses on a period of the Targaryen dynasty. Specifically, House of the Dragon will portray the events of the Dance of the Dragons. Even the name is so exciting. At the height of Targaryen power, King Viserys Targaryen does the impossible and names his daughter as the heir to the Iron Throne. The kingdom couldn't swallow it because he didn't have any sons. But then he does have a son. The conflict between the siblings will fracture the Seven Kingdoms and bring on the fireworks. That means that the show is going to offer a lot of what we loved about Game of Thrones. We're getting politics, we're getting dragons, and we're getting magic, backed by an exciting cast and crew, and a production design that isn't holding anything back from the original show. The House of the Dragon is looking like a winner. And in the blue corner, The Rings of Power. This is a show that has a really tough act to follow. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy were such masterworks of film that no one has ever dared to outdo him, even for the 2000s. Those movies were groundbreaking from technical, acting, and writing standpoints. How do you follow that up? Well, The Rings of Power has a great example of what not to do. Basically, try to be as little as the Hobbit movies as it can be. We have another show that goes into the backstory of its source material, and just like George R.R. Martin, Tolkien has left tons and tons of notes on the history of his fantasy universe. The show's mission is ambitious. It will cover the entire Second Age of Middle-earth, pulling from the books and their appendices. One thing that's interesting about The Rings of Power is that it isn't actually adapting anything. Unlike House of the Dragon, the creators of the show decided to leave the Silmarillion and the other Lord of the Rings spin-off books in their shelves. While the show is based on the real history of Middle-earth, the actual plot content is completely new, and we don't know much about it just yet. What we do know is that in the process, we'll get to see the key events that helped shape the world where the Lord of the Rings took place. Major events include the forging of the Rings of Power, the rise of Sauron, and the fall of Numenor. While the show is taking a Game of Thrones approach of leaning on a lesser-known cast, Amazon is pulling no punches in the production. Watching the trailer, you really do get a sense of magic and a scale that you knew and loved in the original trilogy of movies. There were many skeptics when the show was announced, but they're pretty quiet now. So who will come out on top? The fans. They're the ones with nothing to lose. Regardless of where your true allegiance lies, you're getting 2 hours a week of some of the most anticipated fantasy TV in 2022. The fact that HBO and Amazon haven't changed their release dates to avoid a conflict shows how confident the two are in their shows. Not everyone was as confident. Disney delayed the release of Star Wars Andor to the end of September, probably hoping to avoid the battle of wizards and dragons. We're especially interested to see how the House of the Dragon turns out. Game of Thrones went out on a very sour note, just as HBO was flirting with the idea of blowing this franchise wide open. So this show doesn't have to be just good. It has to be good enough to make up for the tragic ending of Game of Thrones. But The Ring of Power is also important for Amazon. They've been trying for a long time to produce a flagship series for their Prime Video streaming service, but it hasn't panned out so far. The adaptation of The Dark Tower failed before it even aired, and The Wheel of Time isn't performing as well as they'd hoped. The clash between these shows makes us feel like it's an episode 9 of Game of Thrones. Let the battle begin! Next, in other news, initial reviews are coming out for House of the Dragon, and they're good. The show is less than a month away from premiering, and HBO has screened the pilot episode for members of the media. Their impressions? We gotta tune in on the 21st of the month. This first episode has been described as being well done and efficient in establishing the setting and the plot. It also does a great job of creating the intrigue and curiosity that'll have you coming back for episode after episode. Those impressions acknowledge the weaknesses of the latter seasons of Game of Thrones, and in comparison, House of the Dragon sees this universe back at its best. One thing that the House of the Dragon is going to do differently from Game of Thrones: depictions of sex. The first season or two of Game of Thrones were dogged by controversies about their sex scenes. Many critics and viewers thought they were sprinkled a little too liberally throughout the show, and the scenes often portrayed women in less than a flattering way. They were often called sex position scenes, because people noticed that there would be a sex scene thrown in wherever someone had to deliver exposition about something boring. While the show did ease up on these scenes as it went on, they never completely faded away. In fact, the show features some graphic and borderline depraved sexual violence, and it's looking like the House of the Dragon will be bucking the trend. Sarah Hess, writer and executive producer, told Vanity Fair that the show will not be portraying any sexual violence. The upcoming season has a sexual assault in its story, but we only see the impact of the violence on its victim and her mom. It's a far cry from Game of Thrones, which felt the need to show these scenes to portray the status of women in medieval society. That being said, it's not that sex is absent from the House of the Dragon. Matt Smith apparently felt that there might still be too many of them for his taste. And for the Doctor Who fans who've been waiting to see Matt Smith underneath his lab coat, he's definitely in some of those scenes. Too many, in fact, for his liking. We don't mind sex scenes in shows if they add to the show or at least avoid taking away from it. That comment from Matt Smith about being in too many sex scenes isn't great. Emilia Clarke had similar things to say about her own nudity on the show. While season 1 is probably done and dusted, hopefully the show can avoid this in the future. Up next, The Rings of Power apparently shunned the man behind the Lord of the Rings movies. Peter Jackson's name is associated with the Lord of the Rings franchise almost as strongly as Tolkien's himself. Like we mentioned before, he adapted the original books into such fantastic movies that no one has ever dared to try to outdo him. And while his Hobbit trilogy wasn't as good, he still made some entertaining movies under serious constraints. You might expect him to be involved in The Rings of Power, and he expected the same thing. When Amazon asked him to join the project, he asked them to show him some scripts. They said they would, and left him on scene. He doesn't have hard feelings towards the project, though. He said in multiple interviews that he hopes the best for the series, which has a huge budget riding on it. Filmmaking is tough work, and Jackson is one of the hardest workers in the business, so it isn't surprising that he's just rooting for the team behind The Rings of Power to put out a good product. One thing he didn't say, but we're assuming is that he cares a lot about The Lord of the Rings and wants some good content to watch. We're with him on that. And that's it for today's video. How excited are you for these shows? Are you Team Westeros or Team Middle-earth? We're thinking a lot of you are going to be Team No Time for Responsibilities, since you'll be having 2 hours of excellent fantasy content every week. Land your dragons and eagles in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.